Section 6 of the Conjure Woman. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by James K. White. Section 6 of the Conjure Woman by Charles Waddell Chesnutt. The Gray Wolf's Haunt. It was a rainy day at the vineyard. The morning had dawned bright and clear. But the sky had soon clouded, and by 9 o'clock there was a light shower, followed by others at brief intervals. By noon the rain had settled into a dull, steady downpour. The clouds hung low, and seemed to grow denser instead of lighter as they discharged their watery burden, and there was now and then a muttering of distant thunder. Outdoor work was suspended, and I spent most of the day at the house, looking over my accounts and bringing up some arrears of correspondence. Towards 4 o'clock I went out on the piazza, which was broad and dry, and less gloomy than the interior of the house, and composed myself for a quiet smoke. I had lit my cigar and opened the volume I was reading at that time, when my wife, whom I had left dozing on a lounge, came out and took a rocking chair near me. "I wish you would talk to me, or read to me, or something," she exclaimed petulantly. "It's awfully dull here to day." "I'll read to you with pleasure," I replied, and began at the point where I had found my bookmark. The difficulty of dealing with transformations so many-sided as those which all existences have undergone, or are undergoing, is such as to make a complete and deductive interpretation almost hopeless. So to grasp the total process of redistribution of matter and motion, as to see simultaneously its several necessary results in their actual interdependence, is scarcely possible. There is, however, a mode of rendering the process as a whole tolerably comprehensible. Though the genesis of the rearrangement of every evolving aggregate is in itself one, it presents to our intelligence— "John," interrupted my wife, "I wish you would stop reading that nonsense and see who that is coming up the lane." I closed my book with a sigh. I had never been able to interest my wife in the study of philosophy, even when presented in the simplest and most lucid form. Some one was coming up the lane, at least a huge faded cotton umbrella was making progress toward the house, and beneath it a pair of nether extremities in trousers was discernible. Any doubt in my mind as to whose they were was soon resolved when Julius reached the steps, and, putting the umbrella down, got a good dash of the rain as he stepped up on the porch. "Why in the world, Julius," I asked, "didn't you keep the umbrella up until you got under cover?" "It's bad luck, suh, to raise a umbrella in the house, and w'iles I don't know whether it's bad luck to kyar one into the piazza er no, I 'lows it's alluz best ter be on de safe side. I didn' s'pose you en young missis 'u'd be gwine on yo' dribe ter day, but bein' ez it's my pa't ter take you ef you does, I 'lowed I'd report fer duty, en let you say whether er no you wants ter go." "I'm glad you came, Julius," I responded. "We don't want to go driving, of course, in the rain, but I should like to consult you about another matter. I'm thinking of taking in a piece of new ground. What do you imagine it would cost to have that neck of woods down by the swamp cleared up?" The old man's countenance assumed an expression of unwonted seriousness, and he shook his head doubtfully. "I doan know 'bout dat, suh. It mought cos' mo', en it mought cos' less, ez fur ez money is consarned. I ain' denyin' you could cl'ar up dat trac' er lan' fer $100 er a couple er $100, ef you wants ter cl'ar it up. But ef dat 'uz my trac' er lan', I wouldn' 'sturb it, no suh, I wouldn'. Sho's you bawn I wouldn'." "But why not?" I asked. "It ain't fittin' fer grapes, fer new groun' nebber is." "I know it, but—" "It ain' no yearthly good fer cotton, 'cause it's too low." "Perhaps, but it will raise splendid corn." "I don't know," rejoined Julius deprecatorially. "It's so near the swamp that the 'coons'll eat up all the corn." "I think I'll risk it," I answered. "Well, suh," said Julius, "I wishes you much joy of your job. If you has bad luck, er sickness, er trouble er any kind, don't blame me. You can't say old Julius didn't warn you." "Warn him of what, Uncle Julius?" asked my wife. "Er de bad luck w'at follers folks w'at 'sturbs dat trac' er lan'. Dey is snakes en scorpions in dem woods, en ef you manages ter 'scape de p'ison animals, you is des boun' ter hab a ha'nt ter settle wid, ef you doan hab two." "Whose haunt?" my wife demanded with growing interest. "De gray wolf's ha'nt, some folks calls it, but I knows better." "Tell us about it, Uncle Julius," said my wife. "A story will be a godsend to day." It was not difficult to induce the old man to tell a story, if he were in a reminiscent mood. Of tales of the old slavery days he seemed indeed to possess an exhaustless store, some weirdly grotesque, some broadly humorous, some bearing the stamp of truth, faint perhaps, but still discernible, others palpable inventions, whether his own or not we never knew, though his fancy doubtless embellished them. But even the wildest was not without an element of pathos, the tragedy, it might be, of the story itself, the shadow, never absent, of slavery and of ignorance, the sadness always of life as seen by the fading light of an old man's memory. "Way back yonder, befo' de wah," began Julius, "ole Mars Dugal' McAdoo useter own a nigger name' Dan. Dan wuz big en strong en hearty en peaceable en good natured most er de time, but dangerous ter aggravate. He alluz done his task, en never had no trouble wid de w'ite folks, but woe be unto a nigger w'at 'lowed he could fool wid Dan, fer he wuz mos' sho' ter git a good lammin'. Soon ez eve'ybody foun' Dan out, dey didn' many un 'em 'tempt ter 'sturb 'im. De one dat did would 'a wush' he hadn', ef he could 'a' libbed long ernuff ter do any wushin'. It all happen' dis a way. Dey wuz a cunjuh man w'at libbed ober ter de udder side er de Lumberton Road. He had be'n de only cunjuh doctor in de neighborhood fer 'long dis many years, 'tel ole Aun' Peggy sot up in de bizness down by de Wim'l'ton Road. Dis cunjuh man had a son w'at libbed wid 'im, en it wuz dis yer son w'at got mix' up wid Dan, en all 'bout a 'oman. Dey wuz a gal on de plantation name' Mahaly. She wuz a monst'us lackly gal, tall en supple, wid big eyes, en a small foot, en a lively tongue, en w'en Dan tuk ter gwine wid her, eve'ybody 'lowed dey wuz well match', en none er de other nigger men on de plantation dares ter go near her, fer dey wuz all feared er Dan. Now it happen' dat dis yer cunjuh man's son wuz gwine 'long de road one day, w'en who should come pas' but Mahaly, en de minute dis man sot eye on Mahaly, he 'lowed he wuz gwine ter hab her fer hisse'f. He come up side er her en 'mence' ter talk ter her, but she didn' pay no 'tention ter 'im, fer she wuz studyin' 'bout Dan, en she didn' lack dis nigger's looks nohow. So w'en she got ter whar she wuz gwine, dis yer man wa'n't no furder 'long dan he wuz w'en he sta'ted. Co'se, atter he had made up his min' fer ter git Mahaly, he 'mence' ter 'quire 'roun', en soon foun' out all 'bout Dan, en w'at a dangerous nigger he wuz. But dis man 'lowed his daddy wuz a cunjuh man, en so he come out all right in de een', en he kep' right atter Mahaly. Meanwhiles Dan's marster had said dey could git ma'd ef dey want her, en so Dan en Mahaly had tuk up wid one anudder, en wuz libbin' in a cabin by deyse'ves, en wuz des wrop' up in one anudder. But dis yer cunjuh man's son didn' 'pear ter min' Dan's takin' up wid Mahaly, en he kep' on hangin' roun' des de same, 'tel fin'ly one day Mahaly says ter Dan, sez she, 'I wish you'd do somethin' ter stop dat free nigger man fum followin' me roun'. I doan lack 'im nohow, en I ain' got no time fer ter was'e wid no man but you.' Co'se Dan got mad w'en he heard 'bout dis man pesterin' Mahaly, en de nex' night, w'en he seed dis nigger comin' 'long de road, he up and ax him what he mean by hanging roun' his woman. De man didn't respon' to suit Dan, en one word led to anudder, till bimeby dis cunjuh man's son pull out a knife en sta'ted to stick it in Dan, but befo' he could git it drawed good, Dan haul off en hit 'im in de head so hard dat he never got up. Dan 'lowed he'd come to atter a w'ile en go 'long 'bout his business, so he went off en lef' 'im layin' dere on de groun'. De nex' mawnin' de man was foun' dead. Dey was a great 'miration made 'bout it, but Dan didn't say nuffin, en none er de other niggers hadn't seen de fight, so dey wa'n't no way to tell who done de killin'. En bein' ez it was a free nigger, en dey wa'n't no w'ite folks spesh'ly int'rested, dey wa'n't nuffin done 'bout it, en de cunjuh man come en tuk his son en kyar'd 'im away en buried 'im. Now Dan hadn't meant to kill dis nigger, en w'iles he knowed de man hadn't got no mo' d'n he deserved, Dan commenced to worry mo' er less, fer he knowed dis man's daddy would wuk his roots en prob'ly fin' out who'd kilt his son, en make all de trouble fer 'im he could, en Dan kep' on studyin' 'bout dis till he got so he didn't ha'dly dast ter eat er drink fer fear dis cunjuh man had poison de vittles er de water. Fin'lly he 'lowed he'd go ter see Aun Peggy, de new conjure woman w'at had moved down by de Wilmington Road, en ax her fer ter do sump'n ter protect 'im fum dis cunjuh man. So he tuk a peck er 'taters en went down ter her cabin one night. Aun Peggy heared his tale, en den says she, 'Dat cunjuh man is mo' d'n twice ez ole ez I is, en he kin make monst'us powerful goopher. W'at you needs is a life cha'm, en I'll make you one termorrer. It's de only thing w'at'll do you any good. You leave me a couple er hairs from yo' head, en fetch me a pig termorrer night fer de roas', en w'en you come, I'll have de cha'm all ready fer you.' So Dan went down to Aun Peggy de nex' night, wid a young shote, en Aun Peggy gun 'im de cha'm. She had tuk de hairs Dan had lef wid her in a piece er red flannin, en some roots en yerbs, en had put 'em in a little bag made out er coon skin. 'You take dis cha'm,' says she, 'en put it in a bottle er a tin box, en bury it deep under de root er a live oak tree, en ez long ez it stays dere safe en soun', dey ain' no poison kin poison you, dey ain' no rattlesnake kin bite you, dey ain' no scorpion kin sting you. Dis yer cunjuh man mought do one thing er nudder ter you, but he can't kill you. So you neenter be at all skeered, but go 'long 'bout yo' business en don't bother yo' min'.' So Dan went down by de river, en way up on de bank he buried de cha'm deep under de root of a live oak tree, en covered it up en stomped de dirt down en scattered leaves over de spot, en den went home wid his min' easy. Sho' 'nuff, dis yer cunjuh man wuked his roots, des ez Dan had 'spected he would, en soon l'arned who kilt his son. En co'se he made up his min' fer ter git eben wid Dan, so he sont a rattlesnake fer ter sting 'im, but de rattlesnake say de nigger's heels was so hard he couldn't git his sting in. Den he sent his jaybird fer ter put poison in Dan's vittles, but de poison didn't wuk. Den de cunjuh man 'lowed he'd double Dan all up wid de rheumatiz, so he couldn't git his han' ter his mouf ter eat, en would hafter starve ter death. But Dan went ter Aun Peggy, en she gun 'im a ointment ter cure de rheumatiz. Den de cunjuh man 'lowed he'd burn Dan up wid a fever, but Aun Peggy tol' 'im how ter make some yerb tea fer dat. Nuffin dis man tried would kill Dan, so fin'lly de cunjuh man 'lowed Dan mus' hab a life cha'm. Now dis yer jaybird de cunjuh man had was a monst'us smart critter. Fac', de niggers 'lowed he was de ole debbil hisse'f, des settin' roun' waitin' ter kyar dis ole man away w'en he retched de een' er his rope. De cunjuh man sont dis jaybird fer ter watch Dan en fin' out whar he kep' his cha'm. De jaybird hung roun' Dan fer a week er so, en one day he see Dan go down by de ribber en look at a live oak tree, en den de jaybird went back ter his marster en tol' 'im he 'spec' de nigger kep' his life cha'm under dat tree. De cunjuh man laughed en laughed, en he put on his biggest pot en fill it wid his strongest roots, en boil it, till bimeby de win' blowed en blowed till it blowed down de live oak tree. Den he stirred some mo' roots in de pot, en it rained en rained till de water run down de river bank en wash' Dan's life cha'm inter de river, and the bottle went bobbing down the current just as unconcerned as if it wasn't taking po' Dan's chances all along with it. And then the cunjuh man laughed some mo', and 'lowed to hisse'f dat he was gwine ter fix Dan now, sho' 'nuff. He wa'n't gwine ter kill 'im des yet, fer he could do somethin' to 'im w'at would hurt wusser'n killin'. So dis cunjuh man commenced ter gwine up ter Dan's cabin eve'y night, en takin' Dan out in his sleep, en ridin' 'im roun' de roads en fields over de rough groun'. In de mawnin' Dan would be as tired as ef he hadn't be'n ter sleep. Dis kinder thing kep' up fer a week er so, en Dan had des 'bout made up his min' fer ter go en see Aun' Peggy ag'in, w'en who should he come across, gwine 'long de road one day to'ds sundown, but dis yer cunjuh man. Dan felt kinder skeered at fus', but den he 'membered 'bout his life cha'm, w'ich he hadn't be'n ter see fer a week er so, en 'lowed wuz safe en soun' under de live oak tree. En so he helt up his head en walk' 'long des lack he didn' keer nuffin 'bout dis man no mo'n any yuther nigger. W'en he got close ter de cunjuh man, dis cunjuh man sezee, 'Howdy, Brer Dan, I hope you er well.' W'en Dan seed de cunjuh man wuz in a good humor, en didn' 'pear ter bear no malice, Dan 'lowed maybe de cunjuh man hadn't foun' out who killed his son, en so he 'termine' fer ter let on lack he didn' know nuffin, en so sezee, 'Howdy, Uncle Jube.' Dis ole cunjuh man's name wuz Jube. 'I's putty well, thank you. How is you feelin' dis mawnin?' 'I's feelin' ez well ez ole nigger could feel w'at had los' his only son en his main dependence in his ole age. But den my son wuz a bad boy,' sezee, 'en I couldn't 'spec' nuffin e'se. I tried ter l'arn 'im de error er his ways en make 'im go ter chu'ch en prayer meetin', but it wa'n't no use. I don' know who killt 'im, en I don' wanter know, fer I'd be mos' sho' ter find out dat my boy had sta'ted de fuss. Ef I'd had a son like you, Brer Dan, I'd 'a' be'n a proud nigger. Oh, yes, I would, sho's you bawn. But you ain' lookin' ez well ez you oughter, Brer Dan. Dey's somethin' de matter wid you, en w'at's mo', I 'spec' you don' know w'at it is.' Now dis yer kinder talk natchully th'owed Dan off'n his guard, en fus' thing he knowed he wuz talkin' ter dis ole cunjuh man des lack he wuz one er his bes' frien's. He tole 'im all 'bout not feelin' well in de mawnin', en ax' 'im ef he could tell w'at wuz de matter wid 'im. 'Yas,' sez de cunjuh man, 'dere's a witch be'n ridin' you right along. I kin see de marks er de bridle on yo' mouf. En I'll des bet yo' back is raw whar she be'n beatin' you.' 'Yas,' 'spon' Dan, 'so it is.' He hadn' noticed it befo', but now he felt des lack de hide had be'n tuk off'n 'im. 'En yo' thighs is des raw whar de spurs has be'n drivin' in you,' sez de cunjuh man. 'You can't see de raw spots, but you kin feel 'em.' 'Oh, yas,' 'lows Dan, 'dey does hurt powerful bad.' 'En w'at's mo',' sez de cunjuh man, comin' up close ter Dan en whusperin' in his year, 'I knows who it is be'n ridin' you.' 'Who is it?' ax' Dan. 'Tell me who it is.' 'It's a ole nigger 'oman down by Rockfish Crick. She had a pet rabbit, en you kotch 'im one day, en she's be'n squarin' up wid you eber sence. But you better stop her, er e'se she'll be rid ter death in a mont' er so.' 'No,' sez Dan, 'she can't kill me, sho'.' 'I don' know how dat is,' said de cunjuh man, 'but she kin make yo' life mighty mis'able. Ef I wuz in yo' place, I'd stop her right off.' 'But how is I gwine ter stop her?' ax' Dan. 'I don' know nuffin 'bout stoppin' witches.' 'Look here, Dan,' sez de yuther, 'you is a good young man. I likes you monst'us well. Fac', I feels like some er dese days I mought buy you fum yo' marster, ef I could eber make money ernuff at my business dese hard times, en 'dopt you fer my son. I likes you so well dat I'm gwine ter help you git rid er dis yer witch fer good en all. Fer des ez long ez she libs, you is sho' ter have trouble en mo' trouble.' 'You is de bes' frien' I got, Uncle Jube,' sez Dan, 'en I'll 'member yo' kindness ter my dyin' day. Tell me how I kin git rid er dis yer ole witch w'at's be'n ridin' me so hard.' 'In de fus' place,' sez de cunjuh man, 'dis ole witch neber comes in her own shape, but eve'y night At 10 o'clock she turns herself into a black cat, and runs down to your cabin and bridles you and mounts you and drives you out through the chimbley and rides you over the roughest places she can find. All you got to do is to set for her in the bushes side your cabin and hit her in the head with a rock or a lighted knot when she goes past." "But," says Dan, "how can I see her in the dark? And s'posen I hits her and misses her, or s'posen I just wounds her and she gets away, what's she gwine to do to me den?" "I's done studied 'bout all dem things," says de cunjuh man, "en it 'pears ter me de bes' plan fer you ter foller is ter lemme turn you to some creetur w'at kin see in de dark, en w'at kin run des ez fas' ez a cat, en w'at kin bite, en bite fer ter kill. En den you won't hafter have no trouble atter de job is done. I doan know whether you like dat er not, but dat is de sho'est way." "I don't care," 'spon' Dan. "I'd des ez lief be anything fer a hour er so, ef I kin kill dat ole witch. You kin do des w'at you a min' ter." "All right, den," says de cunjuh man, "you come down ter my cabin at half pas' 9 o'clock ter night, en I'll fix you up." Now dis cunjuh man, w'en he had got th'ough talkin' wid Dan, kep' on down de road 'long de side er de plantation, 'tel he met Mahaly comin' home fum work des atter sundown. "How de do, ma'am?" says he. "Is yo' name Sister Mahaly, w'at b'longs ter Mars Dugal' McAdoo?" "Yes," 'spon' Mahaly, "dat's my name, en I b'longs ter Mars Dugal'." "Well," says he, "yo' husban' Dan wuz down by my cabin dis ebenin', en he got bit by a spider er sump'n, en his foot is swole up so he can't walk, en he ax me fer ter fin' you en fetch you down dere ter he'p 'im home. Co'se Mahaly wanter see w'at had happen' ter Dan, en so she sta'ted down de road wid de cunjuh man. Ez soon ez he got her inter his cabin, he shet de do' en sprinkle some goopher mixtry on her, en turnt her ter a black cat. Den he tuk en put her in a barrel, en put a bo'd on de barrel, en a rock on de bo'd, en lef her dere 'tel he got good en ready fer ter use her. 'Long 'bout half pas' 9 o'clock Dan come down ter de cunjuh man's cabin. It was a warm night, en de do' was stannin' open. De cunjuh man 'vised Dan ter come in en pass de time er day wid 'im. Ez soon ez Dan commenced talkin', he heared a cat meowin' en scratchin' en gwine on at a turrible rate. "What's all dat fuss about?" ax' Dan. "Oh, dat ain' nuffin but my ole gray tomcat," says de cunjuh man. "I has ter shut 'im up sometimes fer ter keep 'im in nights, en co'se he don't lack it. Now," 'lows de cunjuh man, "lemme tell you des w'at you is got ter do. W'en you ketches dis witch, you mus' take her right by de throat en bite her right th'ough de neck. Be sho' yo' teef goes th'ough at de fus' bite, en den you won't never be bothered no mo' by dat witch. En w'en you git done, come back here en I'll turn you to yo'self ag'in, so you kin go home en git yo' night's res'." Den de cunjuh man gun Dan somethin' nice en sweet ter drink out'n a new gourd, en in 'bout a minute Dan foun' hisse'f turnt to a gray wolf, en soon ez he felt all four his new feet on de groun', he sta'ted off fas' ez he could fer his own cabin, so he could be sho' en be dere time enough ter ketch de witch en put a een' ter her carryin's on. Ez soon ez Dan wuz gone good, de cunjuh man tuk de rock off'n de bo'd en de bo'd off'n de barrel, en out lep Mahaly en sta'ted fer ter go home, des like a cat er a 'oman er anybody e'se would w'at wuz in trouble, en it wa'n't many minutes befo' she wuz gone up de path ter her own do'. Meanwhiles, w'en Dan had retch de cabin, he had hid hisse'f in a bunch er jimson weeds in de yard. He hadn't waited long befo' he seed a black cat run up de path to'ds de do'. Des ez soon ez she got close ter him, he leapt out en ketch her by de throat, en got a grip on her des like de cunjuh man had tole him ter do, en lo en behold, no sooner had de blood commenced ter flow dan de black cat turnt back ter Mahaly, en Dan seed dat he had kilt his own wife. En w'iles her breff wuz gone she call out, 'Oh, Dan! Oh, my husban'! Come en he'p me! Come en save me fum dis wolf w'at's killin' me!' W'en po' Dan sta'ted to'ds her, ez any man nat'ally would, it des made her holler wuss en wuss. fer she didn't know dis yer wolf was her Dan. En Dan des had ter hide in de weeds en grit his teeth en hol' hisse'f in till she passed out in her misery, callin' fer Dan ter de las', en wonderin' why he didn't come en help her. En Dan 'lowed ter hisse'f he'd ruther 'd be'n kilt a dozen times dan ter done w'at he had ter Mahaly. Dan wuz mighty nigh 'stracted, but w'en Mahaly wuz dead en he got his min' straighten' out a little, it didn' take 'im mo' d'n a minute er so fer ter see th'oo all de cunjuh man's lies, en how de cunjuh man had fooled 'im en made 'im kill Mahaly fer ter git eben wid 'im fer killin' of his son. He kep' gittin' madder en madder, en Mahaly hadn' much mo' d'n drawed her las' breff befo' he sta'ted back ter de cunjuh man's cabin hard ez he could run. W'en he got dere, de do' wuz stannin' open, a lighted knot wuz flickin' on de hearth, en de ole cunjuh man wuz settin' dere noddin' in de corner. Dan leapt in de do' en jump' fer dis man's th'oat, en got de same grip on him w'at de cunjuh man had tol' 'im 'bout half hour befo'. It wuz hard wuk dis time, fer de ole man's neck wuz monst'us tough en stringy, but Dan hilt on long ernuff ter be sho' his job wuz done right. En eben den he didn' hol' on long ernuff, fer w'en he turnt de cunjuh man loose en he fell ober on de flo', de cunjuh man rolt his eyes at Dan, en sezee, 'I's eben wid you, Brer Dan, en you er eben wid me. You kilt my son, en I kilt yo' 'oman, en ez I don't want no mo' d'n w'at's fair 'bout dis thing, ef you'll retch up wid yo' paw en take down dat gourd hangin' on dat peg ober de chimbley, en take a sip er dat mixtry, it'll turn you back to a nigger ag'in, en I kin die mos' satisfied 'n ef I lef you like you is.' Dan nebber 'lowed fer a minute dat a man would lie wid his las' breff, en co'se he seed de sense er gittin' turnt back befo' de cunjuh man died, so he clumb on a chair en retch fer de gourd en tuk a sip er de mixtry, en ez soon ez he done dat, de cunjuh man laugh his las' laugh en gasped out wid his las' gaps. 'Uh-huh, I reckon I's square wid you now fer killin' me too, fer dat goopher on you is done fix' en sot now fer good, en all de cunjuh in de worl' won't nebber take it off. Wolf you is en wolf you stays, all de res' er yo' bawn days.' Co'se Brer Dan couldn't do nuffin, he knowed it wa'n't no use, but he clumb up on de chimbley en got down de gourds en bottles en other cunjuh fixin's, en tried 'em all on hisse'f, but dey didn' do no good. Den he run down ter ole Aun' Peggy, but she didn' know de wolf language, en couldn't 'a' tuk off dis other goopher nohow, eben ef she'd 'a' understood w'at Dan wuz sayin'. So po' Dan wuz 'bleeged ter be a wolf all de rest er his bawn days. Dey foun' Mahaly down by her own cabin nex' mawnin', en eve'ybody made a great 'miration 'bout how she'd be'n kilt. De niggers 'lowed a wolf had bit her. De w'ite folks say no, dey ain' be'n no wolves roun' dere fer 10 years er mo', en dey didn' know w'at ter make out'n it. En w'en dey couldn't fin' Dan nowhar, dey 'lowed he'd quarreled wid Mahaly en kilt her, en run away, en dey didn' know w'at ter make er dat, fer Dan en Mahaly wuz de mos' lovin' couple on de plantation. Dey put de dogs on Dan's scent, en track' 'im down ter ole Uncle Jube's cabin, en foun' de ole man dead, en dey didn' know w'at ter make er dat. En den Dan's scent gun out, en dey didn' know w'at ter make er dat. Mars Dugal' tuk on a heap 'bout losin' 2 er his bes' han's in one day, en ole missus 'lowed it wuz a jedgment on 'im fer sump'n he'd done. But dat fall de crops wuz monst'us big, so Mars Dugal' say de Lawd had tempered de win' ter de shone ram, en make up ter 'im fer w'at he had los'. Dey buried Mahaly down in dat piece er low groun' you er talkin' 'bout cl'arin' up. Ez fer po' Dan, he didn' have nowhere e'se ter go, so he des stayed roun' Mahaly's grave, w'en he wa'n't out in yonder woods gittin' sump'n ter eat. En sometimes w'en night would come, de niggers useter hear 'im howlin' en howlin' down dere, des fittin' ter break his heat. En den some mo' on 'em said dey seed Mahaly's ha'nt dere 'bun'ance er times, colloguin' wid dis gray wolf. En eben now, 50 years sence, long atter ole Dan is died en dried up in de woods, his ha'nt en Mahaly's hangs roun' dat piece er low groun', en eve'ybody w'at goes 'bout dere has some bad luck er n'other, fer ha'nts don't lack ter be 'sturbed on dey own stompin' groun'. The air had darkened while the old man related this harrowing tale. The rising wind whistled around the eaves, slammed the loose window shutters, and, still increasing, drove the rain in fiercer gusts into the piazza. As Julius finished his story, and we rose to seek shelter within doors, the blast caught the angle of some chimney or gable in the rear of the house, and bore to our ears a long wailing note, an epitome, as it were, of remorse and hopelessness. "Dat's jes' like po' ole Dan used to howl," observed Julius, as he reached for his umbrella. "En w'at I be'n tellin' you is de reason I doan lack ter see dat neck er woods cleared up. Co'se it b'longs ter you, en a man kin do ez he choose wid his own. But ef you gits rheumatiz, er fever en ague, er ef you're a snake bit er poison wid some yerb er n'other, er ef a tree falls on you, er a ha'nt runs you en makes you git 'stracted in yo' min', like some folks I knows w'at went foolin' roun' dat piece er lan', you can't say I neber warned you, suh, en tol' you w'at you might look fer en be sho' ter fin'." When I cleared up the land in question, which was not until the following year, I recalled the story Julius had told us, and looked in vain for a sunken grave, or perhaps a few weather bleached bones of some denizen of the forest. I cannot say, of course, that some one had not been buried there, but if so, the hand of time had long since removed any evidence of the fact. If some lone wolf, the last of his pack, had once made his den there, his bones had long since crumbled into dust and gone to fertilize the rank vegetation that formed the undergrowth of this wild spot. I did find, however, a bee tree in the woods, with an ample cavity in its trunk, and an opening through which convenient access could be had to the stores of honey within. I have reason to believe that ever since I had bought the place, and for many years before, Julius had been getting honey from this tree. The gray wolf's haunt had doubtless proved useful in keeping off too inquisitive people, who might have interfered with his monopoly. End of The Gray Wolf's Haunt. Recording by James K. White, Chula Vista.